What's going on, everybody, and welcome back once again. My name is Jordan, also known as JMonster, and I want to thank you guys for joining me for another Silmarillion Total War meta discussion video. Today I'm going to go over where we left off with our comprehensive coverage of types of infantry in Silmarillion Total War, and move on now to the various types of cavalry that can be found within the mod. Do note that not all types of cavalry are one or the other. Some are, some are not. This is very much by design. There are less cavalry units in the game, less factions have access to them. There are more factions that don't have cavalry at all. And there are many more counters to cavalry in the game. So I thought it would be best to give them, in some cases, multiple uses and multiple sets of strengths. And so you'll see that moving forward. So yes, many of the cavalry therefore are hybrids that mix traits from the list that I'm about to read to you. Therefore, in order to avoid confusion, I will address each cavalry unit in the game as it stands, and specifically enumerate their traits as they relate to the upcoming list. So that way you get a better sense of what these units are good at and where they fall within kind of the hierarchy that I'm going to reveal to you in just a few moments. So, with that being said, let's dive right into it. The first type of cavalry we're going to look at today are melee cavalry. And this, I think, is something that a lot of people are going to be very familiar with if you've played a lot of Reforged before. Our stat templates, nevertheless, are a little bit different. So we've got all melee cavalry will have this. They all have +4 versus horses, +3 versus wargs, and +2 versus elephants. So differences in tier between types of cavalry are going to come down more to their stats, coming from their training or their unit type or the faction that they belong to, rather than differentiating them on the tier of their bonuses versus cavalry. The cavalry bonuses are static. Every single melee cavalry unit are going to have the following bonuses, but they are going to be differentiated a little bit by other details. So yeah, they have a low non-armor piercing charge. They enjoy a 10% boost to their armor. They are good against infantry, as they are in many cases essentially mounted infantrymen, due to the slashing damage type, which means, therefore, that these units are actually really good at preying on infantrymen. So foot archers, for example, non-elite foot archers are really going to fear melee cavalry because of that slashing damage type, because of the bonus to their armor, and the mobility that they have, and the mass that comes from their mounts. They can be very, very scary against your foot archers indeed, and 1 or 2 units can eviscerate an entire skirmish line if left unchecked. Next we have Lancers, and they are largely the same as they are in Reforged, with one small caveat. So Lancers receive a -2 penalty versus cavalry, which means that they are quite weak to other horsemen. Other horsemen can deal with them very swiftly. But they do get a +4 bonus against wargs, so they're not completely helpless against warg units. In fact, they can be used to hunt them if you so choose, and if you're able to do that on the battlefield. Obviously, the faction like Holy Gauderoth can bring a lot of wargs versus how many Lancers a lot of factions out there can bring, but it does help. It does help a lot, so they can be quite frightening against warg units, or at the very least they can hold their own. And finally, they get a -4 penalty against elephants. So currently Uroloki are the only elephant class unit in the game. That is going to change. I would really like to have the Balrogs be elephants as well. We do have someone who's working on the animations, just the work on that is going a little bit slow, so currently Balrogs are infantry. But that will change, which means that the nature of Balrogs will change. Their unit size will definitely get smaller, but they'll also get some other bonuses, like area of effect damage, which is very, very devastating. And then, of course, we're going to have a unit of Sauron, in fact, for Tolkien Gauderoth, which will be a single entity unit, and it will enjoy all the bonuses of being elephants. So Lancers will be particularly vulnerable to those types of units. But some of the things Lancers do well, they get an AP charge, and they have a large amount of charge damage. Obviously, Lancers of all types, they have those big scary lances. They will do armor-piercing damage to your units, which means that they are particularly deadly against units that don't have a lot of melee defense. Melee defense can be used to block a Lancer's charge if the, well, 1, if you're lucky, and 2, if that unit is charged from the front, and 3, if their melee defense pool is large enough to at least negate for some of the units that are hit the damage that is incoming from the Lancer charge. So that's an important thing to note. Dwarves in particular will rely very heavily on their armor and their shield at the expense of melee defense. And the same can be said for a lot of, almost all, in fact, orc units in the game. And many wargs as well don't have particularly high melee defense, although it does depend on the tier. The Thrang-Sheik warlords, or Wolfborn rather, are they have a much higher melee defense value, so they can stand up to that a little bit better. But most of the wargs in the game are quite low in terms of their melee defense, so Lancers can be a very effective unit to use against them. Obviously, you won't be able to bring them in the same kind of numbers as specialized factions like Tolian Gauerhoth, so that's something to bear in mind as well. But that's enough about Lancers. Let's move on now to Spear Cavalry. This is our fourth kind of... I don't want to call them melee cavalry, because I don't want people to get confused with the category of melee cavalry. But these are cavalrymen that you're going to have to... You are obliged to make contact with your enemy in order to get any value out of them. So, Spear Cavalry. They shift things around a little bit. They're sort of like, almost like a reverse melee cavalry. So, Spear Cavalry have a +2 bonus against horses, +2 against wargs, and they also have a +4 bonus against elephants, which makes them pretty decent monster hunters. In fact, the only Spear Cavalry... No, there's two. There's the Hishbukraz... Zagul Kalab, who are a hybrid unit, which we'll talk about a little bit. But the Assyrian Outriders of Dwilwyn are a Spear Cavalry unit with a Monster Hunter trait, which gives them an additional +2 against elephants. So they get +6 in total. So you can use them to hunt down elephants units, and you'll be able to do that a little bit more, in a little bit more of a widespread way when facing off against Angband. As I mentioned earlier, I do want to change the classification of a few units that they have. But they also have an arm-piercing charge, decent charge damage. Because of their bonuses, they can be powerful against elephants. But they do have limited damage versus infantry, at least when they're not charging. Because of A, the spear trait, which gives them a bonus versus cavalry, and B, the piercing damage type, which does give them a melee defense penalty against infantrymen. So getting these guys stuck in against infantry is a risky affair. Yes, they can do the same damage of a Lancer unit, or certain Lancer units at the very least, but they are much more vulnerable once they are stuck in close combat, whereas a lot of Lancers tend to be armed with sabers, again by design, because they then get that slashing damage type in pretty well every case for a Lancer. So yeah, let's move on now to Wargs. Wargs are a little bit more tricky to classify because they borrow from a lot of the other categories in the game, but they do have a very distinct set of bonuses versus mount types, which we'll talk about. So they get a +6 bonus versus horses, and a +6 bonus against other wargs. So wargs are good at fighting other wargs. Makes sense. And they also have a slightly higher, but still not amazing bonus against elephants. They get +3. So they kind of skirt the line between melee cavalry and spear cavalry in terms of their effectiveness against elephants. But again, how to classify a warg is going to change, and it's going to change on like faction specialties and things like that. But we'll talk about that as we go through units a little bit later in the video. Next, we move on to the Skirmish Cavalry. These are units that you can use from ranged in order to get some value off of them. In fact, in most cases, it's better if you do that. So, Skirmish Cavalry. The first kind we have is the long-ranged variant, which is, for the time being anyway, Bow Cavalry. Skirmish Cavalry, or rather Bow Cavalry, get a -2 penalty against all mount types. They get double ammunition for their tier, and they get -20% to their melee stats. And their charge is capped at 1, so they can't really be used to charge effectively unless you manage to get behind somebody, which is going to bear fruit for you with just about any kind of unit in the game, especially given how heavy units rely on melee defense in Silmarillion Total War. Next, we have Javelin Cavalry, or JavCav for short, and these are a more short-ranged variant of the Skirmish Cavalry. Their bonuses are similar. They get a -20% to melee stats, so damage and melee defense. Their charge is kept at 1, but they have AP missiles. All Javelin units that are mounted have AP missiles. There are some infantry units, as we discussed in the previous video, that don't have that AP trait on their missiles, but all Javelin Cavalry will. It helps make them a little bit more, I guess, useful, because they have about 3 or so ammunition, but you know, they have like really good accuracy as well, but there's not very many of them, which is the big thing. So the impact that they can have without having armor piercing is really, really limited. So that's why they have the AP trait. And I want to make a note here on some hybrid skirmish cav, because there's not very much in the game at the moment. In fact, the only unit that has a hybrid skirmish cav, I believe, is the House of Feanor. And that's just, you know, their specialty. They're good with their cavalry. And those being, I think it's like the Mounted Company of Amrod or something like that. They share a unit with the Footmen of Amrod, I think. Maybe it's the Footmen of Amras. I really should know this. I should really know the names of my own units, but I don't. But yeah, so they are a melee cavalry unit first, and they don't have any of the penalties of Jav cavalry that we talked about before. But they also do have AP missiles, so it's an example of a hybrid unit. Another one that's in the game that I can't show you currently is the Salamandrine Guard. And I want to turn your attention, therefore, to the Easterling faction and to this one unit in particular. They are a hybrid bow melee cavalry unit. They've got really good stats, good bonuses to their stats because of the way the Easterlings of Boar work. They have a special projectile, which is kind of like poison arrows, but it's got like a fiery kind of look to it, hence the name Salamandrine Guard, the salamander being a fire-breathing like serpent. And with that in mind, they also have a unique weapon type, the Kopesh, which gives them armor piercing and extra melee defense at the expense of making them 5% more expensive. And they also have the Monster Hunter trait, which gives you an idea of what this unit is going to be useful for fighting. They are monster hunters, so they get +2 bonus against elephants, and they're also a melee cavalry unit, so that's going to give them a massive +4, making them at least as good as spear cavalry, who are specialized for fighting monster units. It's a very powerful unit, but it's expensive and limited in both unit size and its cap. So that's how that is. Moving on now to our last two types, which are really kind of a combination of some of the other types that we've seen so far. So first off, we have knights. A lot of people understand knights, especially if you've played Reforged before. They're more of an all-round unit that blend traits from both lancers and melee cavalry, creating a hybrid that's stronger than both. They have an armor-piercing charge. They have the highest charge damage bonuses. They get 10% armor, 35% increased melee stats, 2 HP, and their unit size is quite small. And that's kind of how they are. They get a +5 bonus versus horses, +4 versus wargs, and +4 versus elephants. So they're just kind of good at everything that they do, but not like insanely good. So some of the knights I think in Reforged have like +9 or +10. That's not the case here, but because of their increased melee stats, it does kind of shift that damage onto their less contextual damage, I guess. So they're still a powerful unit. They just don't have like massive, ridiculous bonuses that allow them to, you know, slash through hundreds and hundreds of enemies. You do have to still use them well. You can't just use them. I mean, you can use them as a blunt instrument, but you do need to support them because A, they don't have huge overpowering bonuses, and 2, they don't have the same unit size that you might be used to from other mods like Reforged. So something to bear in mind. Next, we have the Elite Wargs. They are a little bit larger in terms of unit size than the Knights. They have 10% armor. I think they get slightly lower percentages to their stats, but they have a pretty high charge damage bonus, and of course they are armor piercing as well. So they're kind of like Knights, but they take the Warg bonuses as well, so they get the +6 versus Wargs and horses, and then I think it's +3 or so versus elephant units, and they've got a little bit higher numbers in addition to. So yeah, that's kind of the breakdown of the stat templates for all of the various types of cavalry. Let's go ahead and look at some of the cavalry in-game. We can figure out kind of where they fall in relation to everything else. So let's go ahead and do that now. Alright, so the first faction we're going to look at is the House of Feanor. Whoops. A little bit of latency issues there. So this is the Roqueni Magloro, the knight unit for the House of Feanor. And in fact, the only knight unit in the game. So you don't have like 10 that you need to memorize. It's really just these guys. And their bonuses are standard. They are already unique and special by existing, essentially, in the House of Feanor faction. So that's what they do. Next we have here the Mounted Company of Kurufin. Looks like it wasn't either Amarod or Amras. My bad. But yeah, so they're predominantly a melee cavalry unit, so that's the unit or the template that they use for their bonuses. But they have the armor piercing javelins of the of the JavCav. So they don't get the minus 20% penalty that JavCav do, as they're really intended to be used as more of a melee cavalry unit, but they do have that extra little javelin functionality just as a bonus for being part of the House of Feanor, and it gives them some strong like anti-cavalry and like cavalry supremacy options, which is why the unit exists. Over here we have the Riders of the Pass, somewhat related to the Defenders of Agalon. They're infantry cousins, and they're just a pure bow cavalry unit. So all of the bonuses that we talked about earlier, those are going to be what they use. So yeah, pretty straightforward there. And then we have the Mounted Company of Kelegorm, heavy lancers, really good shield value and like armor and things like that. But again, they use the standard lancer values, and that being -2 versus cav or versus horses, +4 versus wargs, and -4 versus elephants. Don't mind them; they don't even have any cavalry. They're just here because I feel like it. Next, we have the Wolf Riders of Angband. Individually, they've got pretty decent melee stats, largely because I think that I can do this if I pause it. There we go. Their stats are not bad. That's just because of their unit size. Unit size does have an effect on your melee stats, but they're smaller, and they're not really as versatile as a lot of the other units, and they don't have the same amount of training either, so their morale is not going to be as high as units like, say, the God, what are they called? The mounted Wolf Guard units for Atolian Gauroth. We're going to see them though in just a minute. So move over here, and we've got, yes, this is their equivalent. Let's go ahead and pause here and take a look at them. Oh no, apparently I can't do that now. It's fine. But these, I believe, are the Hishbukuraz. Not Tharang Sheik. Gijak Skaraz. These are the Gijak Skaraz wargs. They're higher tier, so they've got better like melee defense and damage bonuses, but largely they use the same templates. The one that is different that I'd like to draw your attention to is the Hishbukraz Zagulkalab. And they are a spear cavalry unit in addition to also being javelins. So they've got as they're kind of envisioned to be more of a javelin unit first, they do take the 20% penalty, but they've also got a bonus versus cavalry, although their stat template is similar to Warg. So this one's kind of like a weird jumble of like 3 different things, but they are a Warg unit, so they get the +6 versus horses, etc., etc., but they also have I think it's like a +8 spear bonus that they get from a trait elsewhere in the EDU. So they can be they're potentially very, very powerful against cavalry, despite the fact that they have the -20 penalty to their melee defense and to their just outright damage. But they're also piercing damage, so they're not going to be as powerful against infantry. I don't believe that they have an armor piercing charge the way that a lot of other spear cavalry units will, and their defensive stats being lower means that they die off a lot quicker, so they pay for that damage in some various ways, which is it's a little bit confusing, but it was kind of necessary to avoid it becoming a supremacy unit that punches well above its tier, which is what I wanted to avoid with them. Next, we have the Laugskaraz Gurklab, and they are mounted Skara High units from that tribe, and they have an armor piercing charge, but they have like melee cavalry quality like stats, so they get like +10 to 10% to their armor. Their charge damage is limited. It's not as like massive as a Lancer unit, but it's still armor piercing, and taken in tandem with their damage, it ends up being fairly decent. I think they clock in with like 12 or so armor piercing damage when you upgrade their attack. So it's not bad. They're sort of a hybrid, I suppose, between those two. But they don't have a shield, so they are a little bit vulnerable in that way. Next, we have the Thrang Sheik Warlords, or Wolfborn, one of the two. Can't remember which one it is exactly. But they are the only elite Warg unit in the game, so they use all of the templates there. There's no variation because they're the only one that exists. Over here, we've got the Doriath cavalry units. They have 1 unit of Lancers, and they are just a bog standard Lancer unit. They are light though, so like light armor and things like that, it will increase their movement speed. So they're very, very quick. They can hide everywhere, so they can be used in ambushes, but that's not something that's typical of Lancers, just of this Doriath unit in particular. Next, we have the Mounted Company of Region, and they are just their standard melee cavalry unit. They're high tier, so they have really good bonuses. They have a sword, so they've got that extra melee defense bonus. They're just very, very good, and you can use them as essentially a mobile company of infantry. Most people use them to fight other cavalry. So if you're going to be bringing these guys, it's probably because you think the enemy's going to have cavalry. But if you're fighting against a faction that maybe, or someone who you suspect isn't going to bring a very cavalry-focused build, then you can also use them as infantry units, and they can be very, very useful in that regard, especially if they're getting nice, sexy rear charges. And we'll go over here, and we'll take a look at the Assyrian units. Actually, I think there's bow cavalries around here somewhere. Their bow cavalry is bog standard bow cavalry, barring they've got some extra damage and some extra ammunition from being part of the Green Elves. But the Outriders of Dwelin, as I mentioned, are a monster hunter unit, so they have +6 versus elephants, and then I think +2 versus all other mount types. So they're pretty highly specialized. They've also got a decent AP charge. But again, because they have the piercing damage type and because they have the spear trait, they are quite weak to being left in the fray with infantry units or against other units of cavalry that have the slashing damage type. So they're going to take a melee defense penalty against them. So it ends up kind of working out. Their power dynamic is, on paper, they have a lot of really good bonuses, but there are some really key things that do kind of balance that out and can make them quite vulnerable against other cavalrymen and against infantry as well. So they're like a hybrid. They do a lot of things well, but they are like more specialized towards fighting monsters and things like that. And that's pretty well the run of all the cavalry in the game. We're still in alpha, so we've got another 6 factions to go. The Easterlings will add 2 more, but they will be largely the same. And they will pretty well follow the bonuses, except for the Salamandrine Guard, which I mentioned and went some detail on earlier. The House of Fingolfin will have some Lancers, but they will be pretty bog standard Lancers. The Philothrim will have Lancers. The Gondolin, the House of the Golden Flower, might end up being a little bit different. They're still a long way off. But if they are, I will make an addendum to this video to explain any differences that do arise. And then the Dwarves don't have any cavalry at all. And I think that's pretty well all of the remaining factions in the game. We've got another 5 or so to go, plus maybe 1 extra that may or may not be Valinor, depending on what I want to do there. I don't want to maybe I shouldn't have said anything. I don't want to raise people's hopes, but I am thinking about it, and I'm thinking about maybe having them as a campaign-only faction. But I'm also giving some thought to how they could be added to multiplayer. So it's possible that the Blessed Realm will make an appearance. On the campaign at the very least, but whether or not they end up being added to multiplayer is still a really long way off. Like I said, I've got 5 other factions that I have to get through. So yeah, I hope you guys found this video informative and helpful. Again, if there's something that I can do to inform the oh, there we go. Yeah, they did just pop up, Sentries of Gelion. If there's something that I can do to change the format that is going to be more useful for you guys watching, then please let me know. I got lots of positive feedback in the last video, but not a whole lot of criticism, which, sometimes I'm not sure how to take that. Did I do a really good job? I put a lot of effort into it. I hope I did a really good job. But at the same time, maybe people just, they didn't want to speak up, which is, it's always possible. So if there's something that I can do to make these more interesting or more informative, or if you have questions that weren't covered here, please let me know down in the comment section below. And yeah, just leave some love, leave some comments. These videos do take time and effort to put together, and things like that. So yeah, hopefully it's useful. In any case, my name is Jordan, also known as JMonster. I'll talk to you guys next time. Bye bye.